Will you join me in prayer? Speak to us, O Lord our God, and let the fire of your Spirit burn brightly in our hearts. Open our minds to receive the wisdom of the law, the hope of the prophets, and the life of the gospel. Jesus Christ, your living word. Amen. The message today is about transitions, and I just realized I probably could have transitioned to bass this morning and still sang in the choir. Well, when I was in high school and trying to decide on my future, my parents told me that I could live at home without paying any room and board as long as I was going to college. If I quit and went to work, then I'd have to pay room and board. You see, they really couldn't afford to help me pay for school directly, but as long as I was taking classes, they could support me by allowing me to live at home, which I found out included meals and laundry. So not a hard transition to make, I thought, because as it turned out, I got a scholarship to Wayne State University, which is only about a 30-minute drive away, and I could still eat my mom's home-cooked meals. It was nice living at home, especially since my mom would sometimes make up plates of leftover food and throw them in the freezer for those nights in which I had to stay late at school. But even as wonderful as that was, I knew it was time to make a transition about the third year in college. My sister Patty had her own house, which was about 10 minutes closer to school, so I talked to her about us living together. We always got along, at least as adults. And she worked afternoons, which meant that I would have the house to myself most of the time. And since I couldn't afford to pay her rent while I was in school, we came to an agreement that I could live with her as long as I did all of the maintenance and the laundry and the house cleaning. I didn't really find it that hard of a transition to make, since my parents always expected their kids to help with chores around the house, and I used to cut lawns and do odd jobs for neighbors, and my dad often included me when he was doing home repairs. But the first time I got sick, I felt incredibly alone. There was no one there to take care of me. My mom wasn't there to make soup for me and bring me tea. There was no one to see if I needed anything. And it was then that I realized that living on my own was a more difficult transition than I had expected. Well, today is Transfiguration Sunday, the day Christians celebrate as the day that Jesus' true nature was revealed to the apostles Peter, James, and John. Now, in the sequence we heard from Mark, Jesus took the three of them up on a mountain apart from everyone else. And that mountain setting is important, since throughout the Bible, mountains hold significance as a place of human-divine interaction. A thin place, if you will, a place where the presence of God comes near to humanity. Well, before our story today from Mark, Jesus had been walking with his disciples from town to town, continuing his ministry. And along the way, he taught them that he would have to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed. And then even after 3 days, rise from the dead. Jesus had been trying to teach them about a transition that he would have to undergo, a difficult, painful, but necessary transition. One that, yes, included his death, but a transition that also included his rising again 3 days later. But Peter only heard the death part. He got stuck on the dying part and would have none of it. He rebuked Jesus for even talking about his death. You see, Peter and the other disciples saw Jesus as a human Messiah, as one who would lead them perhaps in a revolt against the earthly powers that controlled their land and the people. They couldn't conceive that Jesus would be killed, nor that any such event could ever have a great outcome. That was not the transition that they had in mind. They couldn't wrap their minds around what he meant by being raised from the dead. And Jesus got angry and he said, "Look, you're focusing on the wrong things. You're thinking about human thoughts, not God thoughts. If you really want to follow me, you have to change your way of thinking. You have to give up your wants and your needs. Take up your cross and follow me." Well, can you imagine the confusion and the wonder that the disciples were feeling at hearing Jesus' words? And time after time in Mark, we find Jesus admonishing his disciples for failing to comprehend what he was trying to tell them, for being too narrowly focused on what and who they thought Jesus was, on who they expected him to be. And in the midst of this, Mark tells us, Jesus paused on their journey to go up on a mountain, and he took Peter, James, and John with him. Well, transitions are often not very easy, especially, I believe, when they involve discerning God's will in our lives. Our expectations of what should be don't often match what actually happens. You see, we have in our mind a vision of how things should work out, a vision of what we would like the future to look like. But the problem is, when we're always thinking in this way, sometimes we fail to see the real possibilities that may be before us. We can become so focused on our own vision that we fail to see the bigger picture. And so transitions often require time away from the busyness to gather our thoughts and reflect on what's going on, to think about where we are and where God is calling us. And so it is, and so it was, with Jesus and the disciples. Well, while Jesus was on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, as I said in the children's message, something unexpected happened. And the text tells us that Jesus was transfigured before him, and his clothes became dazzling white. And as the disciples looked on, they suddenly saw Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Moses and Elijah, two of the greatest figures from their Jewish past, standing there talking with Jesus. That was not at all what they were expecting, and they were terrified, unable to really comprehend what they were seeing. Peter said, "Rabbi, it's so good for us to be here. Let's build 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." You see, Peter wanted to capture that moment in time. Peter wanted everything to remain just as it was in that magical moment. And no sooner had the words left Peter's mouth than a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Listen to him. The disciples had their own expectations of what the future would look like. And Peter had thought he saw a vision of it up there on the mountain. And yet the voice said emphatically that they should listen to Jesus. They should listen to him. So what was it that Jesus was trying to tell the disciples before they got to the mountain? What was it that Jesus said that made Peter so angry? He said, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." After 3 days, rise again. Listen to him, the voice said. So they were up there on the mountain where Moses and Elijah had been speaking to Jesus. Moses and Elijah. But with the echoes of the command, "Listen to him," still echoing in their ears, Moses and Elijah disappeared. As quickly as it happened, it was over. And it was just the 4 of them alone on the mountain. Jesus knew they could not stay there. They had to go down. They had to go back to doing what Jesus said he had come out to do, to be among the people, healing them, teaching them, traveling from place to place, showing people the realm of God bursting forth in their midst. When I said I was leaving to go to another church, I could tell there was some concern about a transition to a new pastor. Transitions are hard. Believe me, I know. And even though I've been here 5 years, I can imagine that the 3 years of searching that it took to find and call me as your pastor were still fresh in your minds. But I want to assure you that you are in a far different place than you were when you last began a pastoral search. Think about it. A lot had happened in the 3 years before you began that search, the search that ended up with my being called to be your settled pastor. There was a lot of stress and anxiety in the church at that time. But I know you've come a long way down a path of healing and reconciliation, a good path that led to the development of our new vision for the congregation this last year. And with the help of Bonnie Bates and the members of the church council, work has already begun in searching for a designated transitional pastor whom you can call as your settled pastor, if that's your desire. And you met as a congregation a couple of weeks ago to approve this process as the one that you'll follow, a process which includes my participation in making the transition as smooth as possible. There is a great possibility ahead if you trust in the process with open hearts and open minds. And pray for God's strength and guidance along the way. Elijah was a prophet called by God. And you can read more about his call in 1 and 2 Kings, and it's a fascinating story filled with compassion and intrigue. A story, I think, that would make a great Hollywood blockbuster. And anyway, the story from 2 Kings that we heard today tells of the transition from Elijah to Elisha as the prophet of God's people. And it too is very interesting. Because Elijah seemed to be at the height of his career as a prophet. And yet God seems to have another plan. So God guided Elijah and to anoint Elisha as his apprentice. And Elisha was out working the fields of his parents' farm when Elijah found him and threw his mantle about his shoulders, identifying Elisha as his protege, just as God had instructed Elijah to do. Now Elisha was no ordinary man, as evidenced by the story. 1 Kings tells us that Elisha was plowing the fields with 12 yoke of oxen. 12 yoke. That's 24 oxen. This was no run-of-the-mill, small-time farm. This was a big operation. Elisha had to give up a lot to follow Elijah. And yet, if we believe the story, when Elijah calls him, Elisha asks only one thing, that he be allowed to say farewell to his parents. Now, Elisha knew that following Elijah would require a radical break from his familial and social ties, that it would require giving up his own identity to respond to God's will in his life. Talk about a hard transition. But Elisha doesn't hesitate. He goes all in. And he even slaughters all 24 of his oxen, cooking them over a fire built from the yokes. And he uses the meat to feed the people. He can never go back. And so we come to our text today. And for some reason that we're not really told of, Elijah's time is nearing the end, and he'll soon be taken up, as the scripture says, up to heaven by a whirlwind. And as they travel on, Elijah kept trying to tell Elisha to stay behind. But Elisha would have nothing of it. As the Lord lives, he says, and you yourself live, I will not leave you. Elisha resisted the transition over and over again. A company of prophets following them told Elisha that Elijah would be leaving, and he responds, yes, I know, be quiet. He wanted to ignore the transition, perhaps hoping that it wasn't true. Over and over again, Elijah tells him to stay behind. Elisha continues to say that he would never leave Elijah. Mr. Knapp, I read through it. Elijah knows he must move on, that he must go where God has called him to go. Elisha knows. He knows it in his heart, and he has shown in the past that he's capable of doing what God has told him to do. And he's given up so much already. He doesn't want to leave his mentor. Finally, Elijah asks what he can do for Elisha, reminding him that nothing is really in his control. It's all up to God. And the chariots come, and Elijah is taken to heaven. And Elisha's there to witness it all, and he receives what he had asked for. And as Elijah said, it's a difficult transition. Elisha is overcome with grief. He loved Elijah, and now Elijah is gone. Grieving, he tears his garments in two. Transitions are hard. But sometimes in order to follow God's will in our lives, we have to focus on the greater good. We have to focus on how God is calling us to be the agents of change in a world filled with fear, anger, and division. Jesus led the disciples down the mountain so that he could become the people he already knew them to be, so that they could continue the work that he had begun in the world. Elisha, too, picked up the mantle that had fallen from Elijah and became the prophet that God knew him to be. And so it is with us. Transitions are hard, but they're moments of opportunity. Opportunity to become the people who God created us to be. Trust in God. Pick up the mantle and do what you've been called to do. Come down the mountain and become the disciples God already knows you to be. Follow Christ, and you will never be alone. Amen.